The brutal revenge murders of 4 members of the Morby family and their schoolteacher occurred around 11 o'clock on a cold winter's night on the 20th of July 1900. The killings began when Jimmy Governor knocked on the front door of the Morby's new farmhouse, and his accomplice, Jackie Underwood, entered it through the back door. The schoolteacher, Helen Kurtz, opened the front door, and when she saw it was Jimmy, she levelled some insults at him. Sarah Morby was hit on the head with a tomahawk. Meanwhile, at the back of the house, 14-year-old Percy Morby had challenged Jackie Underwood with a rifle that had no ammunition. For his trouble, he had his head bashed in, and his head almost severed from his body by a tomahawk. As Mrs. Morby was reeling backwards from the blow to her head, she fell on her dead, almost decapitated son. Blood was flowing, streaming in red rivulets across the brown wooden floor and splattering across the wooden walls. Screams of terrified victims of the carnage were heard in the air. But the farm was isolated, and no one was willing, and no one was able, to come and help them. The 3-month rampage of Jimmy Governor and his motley crew had begun. Let's take a stab at this. Hi mates, and welcome to Something About Murder. I'm Jay Something, and every week I bring you a couple of cases from Australia's true crime history. If this sounds interesting to you, please help us out by shooting the like button with your trusty boomstick, hitting the subscribe button with that stabby stabs, and then punching the notification bell in the face to be notified every time we release a new video. All of our episodes are released at the same time in podcast format on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your true crime podcast fix. Also, we now have Something About Murder merchandise, designed by myself, as well as Australian artist Redneck Kung Fu. It's just a few things here and there, just a couple of t-shirts, but I'll put the link in the description, you can see them below. If you'd like to support our channel by buying me a beer or a coffee, please do so at buymeacoffee.com/jsomething. It takes a lot of time to put together these episodes. It's much better to have a beer to look forward to after filming. The link is in the description. Few bushrangers have such a horrific and blood-soaked history as Jimmy Governor. Today's subject struck terror in New South Wales at the turn of last century, killing 9 people, mostly women and children. His reign of terror signified the end of the colonial era in Australia with his 3-month rampage at the dawn of Federation. He was also the last outlaw in Australia's history. Caution: the following episode discusses First Nations people and will also include images of persons now deceased. I should also hasten to add that some of the ways in which First Nations people are spoken about in this episode, whilst historically accurate, are offensive in the extreme. I caution you to listen to this episode in the context in which it has been written. Jimmy Governor was born in about 1875 on the Tabragar River near Denison Town, a ghost town near Dunedoo in New South Wales. He was the son of Tommy Grosvenor, which later was changed to Governor, and Annie Fitzgerald. Tommy Governor was a First Nations man from the Namoi River region. He was a hard-working father who had arrived in the Mudgee area as a young man in the mid-1850s and found steady work engaging in bark getting, driving stock and other bushwork for a variety of employers. Jimmy's mother, Annie Fitzgerald, was raised on Kygan Station, northeast of Mendoran, near Dunedoo. She was the daughter of an Irish stockman named Jack Fitzgerald and a First Nations mother named Polly, who worked as a house servant. Annie's father died before she was born, and so she was raised by Polly and her First Nation stepfather, Henry. She was described, using the vocabulary of the day, as a half-caste with all the manners and customs of the pure black. Tommy Governor took work wherever he could find it, and his growing family went with him. Jimmy was the eldest of 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. The children attended a number of different schools as they moved from place to place. In 1887, while mending a dam east of Dunedoo, Tommy Governor found samples of metal-bearing ore, which he showed to George Stewart, the manager of the Pine Ridge Station. Stewart had them tested, revealing that they contained silver, after which he took up mineral leases of 70 acres and formed a company of Mudgee businessmen to work what became known as the Mount Stewart Silver Mine. In 1888, the original promoters of the Mount Stewart and Grosvenor leases presented Tommy Governor with a small purse of money as he left the district. The fact that he received no significant benefit for his discovery of the silver field remained a source of resentment for Tommy Governor. And so Tommy and Annie relocated with the family to the Paterson River and Singleton districts from 1888. And Tommy and his sons worked on stations along the Paterson River, often receiving rations only as remuneration. This was the habit of white people at the time. It wasn't strictly slavery, but fuck, it was close enough. They've paid them in food, goods, and things like that. Fuck giving them money. Schooling for the 8 Governor children was irregular as the family moved from place to place, contingent on Tommy finding work. Jimmy attended around 6 different schools and was described as a smart, athletic, and cheerful native, while his younger brother Joe was described as rather sullen and morose. Increasingly, however, the Governor family were drawn into the First Nations reserve system, which sought to confine and control Indigenous people by separating them from the white population, eventually being forced to live in a First Nations camp on the Sinclair Reserve north of Singleton. In August 1890, Tommy Governor was involved in an altercation with another First Nations man at the Singleton camp, known locally as the Blacks Camp. During the fight, Governor stabbed the man several times with a small knife. He was subsequently tried on charge of malicious wounding, found guilty, and was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment with hard labour in Maitland Jail. After his release from jail, Tommy Governor moved his family westwards back to the Gulgong district. The family set up camp on the First Nations Reserve in the police paddock across the creek from Wallar Township. In 1890, aged 15, Jimmy Governor was lopping trees on properties in the Dunedoo district. Later, he and his brother Joe worked along the Allen River and the Singleton district, doing a variety of jobs including fencing, mustering stock, and breaking horses. His father's example had given Jimmy Governor a strong sense of independence and a determination to work hard and survive in the white world. He'd experienced life in First Nations reserves and reacted against the degrading conditions he witnessed, resolving to work for wages, not rations and handouts. During this period of his life, Jimmy Governor had his first significant adverse encounter with the justice system. In February 1893, he was convicted of stealing at Denison Town near Dunedoo and received a sentence of 1 month imprisonment, although the offence is more likely to have been riding a horse without the owner's permission. By the mid-1890s, with his family living on the First Nations Reserve at Wallar, Jimmy Governor worked on stations and farms in the district. In July 1896, Governor, aged 21, enlisted as a police tracker with the New South Wales Mounted Police and was stationed at Cassillis. His stint as a police tracker lasted through until December 1897. After leaving the police, Governor returned to Wallar for a while, after which he was engaged cutting wood near Gulgong by Jonathan Starr. Then he worked as a shed hand on Digibar Station, north of Dunedoo, before returning to Gulgong. It was around this time that he met 15-year-old Ethel Page, who was working at Ryan's Bakery in Gulgong Township. Whenever he could get to town, Jimmy Governor courted Ethel, and in August 1898, she became pregnant. The pair married in December 1898 in the rectory of St. Luke's Anglican Church at Gulgong, with Jimmy wearing a borrowed white cricket suit for the occasion. A later report claimed that the celebrant, Reverend Haviland, had only consented to perform the ceremony at the earnest solicitation of the girl's mother, who, for reasons which may be understood, wished to save her daughter's reputation. Jimmy and Ethel lived in a house in the Gulgore district next to Ethel's parents, where she gave birth to a son named Sydney in early April 1899. Her father didn't approve of Ethel's marriage to Jimmy, and after the birth, he relocated to Dubbo, where his wife and family soon joined him. By the end of 1899, after a difficult year of disapproval and condemnation of his marriage from Ethel's family as well as Gulgong locals, Jimmy Governor decided to move away from the district. After leaving their young baby with Ethel's parents in Dubbo in April 1900, Jimmy got a contract for fencing from John Morby at his property, Old Breelong, near Gilgandra. Jimmy was contracted to construct 3 miles of fencing, a job that would take probably about a year. The Governors made their camp further up the creek, about 3 miles from the Morby home and near where Jimmy would be working. Jimmy and Ethel constructed a gunya at the camp from bark sheets propped against a large log and laid bark and leaves on the floor for bedding. John Morby had agreed to supply rations of flour, meat and sugar, but any extras would be charged. The arrangement also involved Ethel working in the house several times a week as a domestic servant. Conscientious and anxious to prove himself in white society, Jimmy was on good terms with his employer, obtaining his rations from him and playing cricket with his small sons. In the meantime, Jimmy's father Tommy died in May 1900. Old Breelong Station had been declared a provisional school, so teacher Helen Kurtz boarded at the new house and taught the Morby children there, as well as others from the district. Generally, the Morby men slept in the inn, while the women and young children occupied the new house. From the outset, Ethel Governor was subjected to ridicule and sarcasm from the women of the household, particularly Sarah Morby, the mother of the children, her 16-year-old daughter Grace, and teacher Helen Kurtz. The comments were directed at her lowly position as a household servant and the fact that she was married to a First Nations man. The manner in which Ethel was treated during the day was an issue that festered and became magnified in the ensuing months. After they had settled at Breelong, Jimmy and Ethel decided to fetch their baby, and a subsequent incident seems indicative of the tensions that had developed. Ethel rode to Dubbo on a borrowed horse to collect her child, and when she arrived back with the baby at the Morby homestead, it had begun raining. The women took the baby to warm it by the fire, and while Ethel was unsaddling the horse, she watched through the window as the women ridiculed and laughed at her child. Ethel then went into the house, grabbed her baby, and walked the 3 miles to her camp, seething with anger. In late June, the Governors received a visit from Jimmy's brother Joe and a friend, Jack Underwood. Underwood was aged about 38 years, he walked with a limp, and he was blind in one eye. The two men were on their way to the Red Bank Mission near Coonamble to visit family members. They returned after 9 days to help Jimmy with the fencing work, accompanied by 80-year-old Jack Porter and the Governor brothers' young nephew, Peter Governor. Joe Governor and Jack Underwood set up their camp about 100 metres from the Governor's campsite, and Porter and young Peter camped another 100 metres further away. Bitterness towards the Morbys increased in Jimmy Governor's mind as the weather turned colder at Breelong. Jimmy had complained that Sarah Morby had overcharged him for rations when she compiled the bill, and often remarked to his wife that Mrs. Morby was a swindler. Another grievance arose in early July when John Morby rejected about 100 of the posts that had been split. After negotiation, he agreed to pay half price, as they would do for a cross fence. As the grievances piled up and his resentment increased, Governor began to fantasize about going into bushranging. Later, Jimmy said that he, Ethel, Joe and Jack Underwood would talk about bushranging at night after their work was done, with the discussions taking the form of boastful talk and bravado between the men. On Friday evening, the 20th of July 1900, Jimmy and Ethel Governor were arguing at their camp. Jimmy was extremely agitated, accusing Ethel of cheating on him with his brother Joe. After a while, though, the conversation turned to the subject of the Morbys. Ethel provoked Jimmy by saying that the Morbys did whatever they wanted with him. In response, Jimmy got ready and went to the main house with Ethel, Joe and Jackie Underwood. By this stage it was late in the evening, between 10 and 11 o'clock. Several of the men carried weapons. Jack Underwood had a rifle and a tomahawk, and Jimmy Governor carried a nulla nulla, which is kind of a hardwood club. They had no bullets or gunpowder, so taking the gun suggests that the weapons at this point were being carried for the purpose of, intimidation. The group went first to the Old Inn, where John Morby, his brother-in-law Fred Clark, and the two eldest Morby sons were staying. Jimmy and Underwood approached the inn and called for Morby, who came outside. Jimmy asked him for a bag of flour and a bag of sugar, to which Morby replied that he'd provide them sometime the following day. Jimmy and Jack then returned to where the others were waiting, and Jimmy said to his wife, "I'm going to see Mrs. Morby about those words she has been saying. I'll make her mind what she's talking about." The group then walked to the Morby house in order for Jimmy to confront Sarah Morby. Sarah and Helen Kurtz came to the door, and Governor said, "Did you tell my missus that any white woman who married a fucking blackfellow ought to be shot? Did you ask my wife about her private business? Did you ask her what sort of nature did I have, black or white?" The women, for their part, they just laughed at him, and so Jimmy just punched Sarah in the mouth. Helen Kurtz then called Jimmy black rubbish and said that he should be shot for marrying a white woman. Jimmy then hit Helen on the jaw, knocking her to the floor. He then lost his temper and began further attacking the women. This set off a series of chaotic and murderous events. A panel on the front door was shattered by a tomahawk, indicating it had been closed against the assailants. Sarah Morby was mortally wounded by 5 dreadful gashes to her neck and head inflicted by Jimmy Governor. Helen Kurtz and 16-year-old Grace Morby retreated to an adjoining bedroom where Hilda Morby, aged 11, and Elsie Clark were in bed. 3 boys, Percy Morby, aged 14, Bert Morby, aged 9, and their cousin George, aged 13, were sleeping in an enclosed veranda and woke to the noise. George hid under a bed and Percy went to confront the attacker, but was chopped down and killed by Jack Underwood as he entered the front sitting room where his mother lay. The door to the bedroom, where the women had retreated, was smashed in, but Miss Kurtz and the 2 Morby girls managed to escape by climbing out a window. However, 19-year-old Elsie Clark was caught and attacked with a nulla, receiving severe wounds to her face and head. After they climbed out the window, Miss Kurtz and the 2 girls started running towards the inn, and Jimmy set off in pursuit. He caught up with Helen Kurtz and Grace Morby, killing the teacher with a tomahawk to the face and mortally wounding Grace, her head and face smashed with a nulla and then cut with a tomahawk. Hilda Morby was ahead of the other 2, but stumbled and fell down the steep bank of a creek. Jimmy caught up with her and hit her with repeated blows from his nulla, caving in her skull. Amidst the chaos and slaughter, young Bert Morby managed to slip out of the house. The terrified boy hid in the bushes near the creek for some time before running to the old inn to tell his father the dreadful news. John Morby grabbed his gun and ran to the house, closely followed by his son Reggie and Fred Clark. They arrived barely 10 minutes after the murders had begun, but Jimmy and his group had already fled. The only family members who remained uninjured were Bert, George, who had hidden under the bed, and the 2 youngest children who had been sleeping in a separate kitchen behind the house. Percy Morby, Hilda Morby, and Helen Kurtz were dead. Grace Morby lingered for 2 days before succumbing from her wounds. Sarah Morby died on the 24th of July. Elsie Clark survived her serious injuries, but was made permanently deaf from the blows that she had received. Jimmy and the others gathered back at their campsite before leaving as a group in a general and desperate flight, including Porter and the boy Peter, who were caught up in the panic situation. Near sunrise, Jimmy killed Jackie Porter's dog with a bundi to stop it barking, and the group stopped and made a fire. Knowing his wife could not keep up with them, Jimmy told Ethel to make her way with the baby to her parents' place at Dubbo. Ethel walked through the bush until she found the Dubbo Road and was intercepted soon afterwards by a group of armed men riding to Gilgandra to join the hunt for the breelong murderers. She was taken back to the Morby property and locked in a room at the Old Inn. Jackie Porter and young Peter Governor also separated from Jimmy and the other men, and they were found hiding in the bush on Monday the 23rd of July in the Boydben area southeast of Breelong, and were taken initially to the Mendura lockup. During the days following the murders, the Governor brothers and Jack Underwood, travelling southeast, reached Granby Station, where they narrowly avoided discovery by a party of armed men. That evening, near Mendoran, they met a selector named Ison who knew Jimmy Governor. Ison hadn't heard of the murders, and when Governor asked for something to eat, some tucker, he obliged. The next day, the fugitives were seen by William Davidson, a sleeper cutter, on Digelar Station, which was north of Dunedoo. Davidson fired several shots at the men and they escaped into the surrounding bush. A swag that was left at the scene, when unrolled, was found to contain a tomahawk and bundi, both of them bloodstained. In making their escape, the brothers headed in a different direction to Jack Underwood. The older man, who was obviously partially lame, had failed to keep up with the other 2 and they had to constantly stop and wait for him. On the evening of the 22nd of July, after the Governor brothers had separated from Jack Underwood, they were spotted at Slapdash Creek, both riding bareback on a grey horse. That night they were given food by Charlie Wade and spent the night in a hut near Wade's house on Tallawang Creek. In the morning they headed east towards the village of Ulan. In the early afternoon of the 23rd of July, Jimmy and Joe Governor arrived at the farm of Alexander Mackay at Sportsman's Hollow, 2 miles from Ulan. Mackay, aged 70, was pruning a fig tree near his boundary fence when the 2 men approached him, carrying a rifle and a tomahawk. The farmer was mortally wounded by a vicious blow from the tomahawk onto the top of his head. Jimmy and Joe Governor then approached the house, calling out, "We are going to kill the lot of you." Mackay's wife Mary was on the veranda and made a rush for the door as Jimmy Governor struck at her with a stick, fracturing her left temple. She managed to get inside, but the Governors broke several windows and eventually gained entry to the house. An 18-year-old woman, Louisa Johnson, was also residing with the Mackays. The Governors took money and some clothes before leaving on a stolen horse and saddle. The two women discovered Alexander Mackay by the fig tree, groaning, and so they carried him to the house, but he died soon afterwards. The murder of Alexander Mackay was the first instance of Jimmy Governor seeking vengeance for a perceived past grievance. He'd spoken of his intentions to Ethel, who later gave police a list of 15 potential victims for Jimmy's retribution. Now, as a notorious murderer on the run, with the initial police response in relative disarray, Jimmy systematically sought out victims to settle old scores. Alexander Mackay's wife was in no doubt that the motive of the crime was revenge, stating that some years ago her husband had accused Jimmy Governor of obtaining food by false representations when he was eluding arrest on the charge of horse stealing. After they left the Mackay farm, Jimmy and Joe Governor were sighted by two boys at Byers' house near Ulan, where they took a horse, so now both brothers had mounts. Near the junction of the roads to Wallar and Cassilis east of Ulan, the brothers spoke to two Indian men and asked them to source some ammo and leave it at a location near Wallar, adding that they intended to murder Harry Neville. That night, the Governor brothers went to Harry Neville's Crowe station, which was on the Goulburn River, north of Wallar, but Neville had already left, having suspected he might receive a little visit from Jimmy. Either way, the brothers broke into the empty house and stole a saddle and a gun, and in the meantime, Jack Underwood had found himself alone. On Tuesday the 24th of July, Underwood, walking without food or blankets, called at William Shaw's selection near Leadville. Claiming his name was Charlie Brown, Underwood said he had come from Wellington and hadn't eaten in 3 days. Shaw suspected that his guest was one of the breelong murderers and provided food and conversation while his wife proceeded to a neighbouring selection to seek assistance. Contact was made with a group searching for the fugitives, who proceeded to Shaw's selection and captured Underwood without resistance. He was taken to the lockup at Leadville and guarded by civilians as no police were present at the time. 2 days later, Underwood, under guard, was taken by coach to the jail at Mudgee. On the same day, instead of going to the proposed ammunition drop-off location, which is where the police were waiting, the Governor brothers headed further to the east. Mid-morning, they arrived at the Michael O'Brien station at Poggy near Merriwa. O'Brien's wife Elizabeth, her 18-month-old son James, and a nurse, Catherine Bennett, were sitting in the detached kitchen behind the house. Lizzie O'Brien was heavily pregnant, and Mrs. Bennett was staying with her to assist with the birth. The Governor brothers suddenly appeared at the kitchen door. Mrs. O'Brien said, "What do you want?" And Jimmy replied, "You speak civil. Surrender, or I will shoot you." With these words, Governor fired his gun at the women. Lizzie O'Brien and Catherine Bennett were shot several times, and Joe hit Mrs. O'Brien with his tomahawk, inflicting a fatal blow. Jimmy broke the rifle stock by using it to beat the child to death. The Governors then ransacked the house, taking money, clothes, and boots. On a blank cheque form, they wrote, "You dog, I shoot you also." Catherine Bennett was still alive, shot with a bullet that entered her collarbone and passed through her chest. She staggered from the kitchen after her assailants had fled and found Michael O'Brien. O'Brien walked to a neighbouring station and a rider was sent to Merriwa to alert the police. But by the time the troopers had arrived, Jimmy and Joe Governor had long since fled. But Mrs. Bennett had been laying for 6 hours in the bush, suffering from exposure. The motive behind the attack at the O'Brien station was apparently long-standing grudge held by Jimmy. Years beforehand, during a cricket match being played at Wallar, Jimmy made a bit of a pest of himself, and Michael O'Brien grabbed him and chucked him in the creek to quieten him down a bit. On the 25th of July, a notification was published offering a reward of £200 for the apprehension of each of the offenders, Jimmy and Joe Governor. On Thursday, the 26th of July, the Governor brothers broke into an empty house belonging to Thomas Hughes, stealing a Winchester rifle and ammunition. Now in the vicinity of Wallar, they headed to Kieran Fitzpatrick's farm. Jimmy believed Fitzpatrick had poisoned his dogs years beforehand, so here was another score to settle. Fitzpatrick, aged 74, lived with his 23-year-old nephew Bernard. Mid-morning, Bernard went to his brother's nearby farm, and the governors then took their opportunity. Jimmy approached the house and called for Fitzpatrick, who came out with his rifle ready. Joe fired from a hiding place, hitting the old man in the shoulder. Jimmy rushed at him with an axe and struck him twice on the head. Bernard heard the shot that had been fired and returned to see the governors still there and his uncle dead. He fired a shot at the murderers and then ran to Walla for help. It was by now around a week after the murders at Breelong, and so it was reported that considerably over 100 police, together with 12 trackers, were searching for Jimmy and Joe Governor. It was proposed to swear in a number of special constables, with bushmen who knew the country well being preferred. The colonial secretary stated that the act authorising the government to declare the murderers to be outlaws had expired, otherwise they would have been immediately outlawed, which meant that they could be shot on sight. A broad region of New South Wales, lying between the northern and western railway systems within the boundary of lines drawn between Gilgandra and Muswell Brook on the north and Mudgee and Newcastle on the south, was now on high alert. The resources of every police station within that area were being called upon. It was reported that business on the farms or in the shops practically at a standstill, and those who were not engaged in the active work of search and pursuit spent their time in speculation and discussion of the tragedies and their perpetrators. Settlers moved out of their homesteads in fear of the governors, with women and children brought together in towns for safety, while many of the men joined the pursuit. After the murder of Kieran Fitzpatrick outside of Walla, and the fact that Jimmy and Joe Governor's mother and younger siblings were living on the First Nations Reserve at Walla, the township became a focus of attention by police authorities and the colonial press. A visitor in late July noted, "When we rode into the town, we met men armed to the teeth, riding around looking out sharply for any sign of blacks." The police had brought all of the local First Nations people into the township in order to keep them under surveillance. At night, they were locked up in a hall which had been appropriated for their accommodation. Such was the fear and panic in the Walla district that families from up and down the Walla Creek travelled into town for safety. A visitor to the Merriwa and Cassillis district in late July recounted that the people were terror-stricken for miles around, and nearly every person was carrying firearms in fear of meeting the blacks. It was stated that every hut and house in the Walla Ranges district had been vacated, and it was next to impossible to obtain a bed at any of the hotels in Merriwa or Cassillis, and it was observed that local stores had completely sold out of rifles. Jimmy Governor had frequently been at Gula, and it was feared that he may visit people that he had previously argued with. On the 29th of July, the hut of a Chinese man was robbed near Gulgong, and the following day the governors were seen at 2 Mile Flat. Later, the brothers were camped near the village of Yamble when a party of pursuers surprised them while they were preparing a meal. The tracks of the fugitives were lost at the Gudgegong River near Gulma, west of Gulgong, and for about a week no information of their whereabouts was obtained. Over the next 3 months, the two Governor brothers carried out a series of break-ins, robberies and assaults. They showed great skill, ingenuity and bushcraft in eluding their pursuers. The manhunt that got underway to capture them was reputedly Australia's largest at the time, estimated to have involved over 200 police and trackers and about 2,000 armed civilian volunteers. The reward was increased on the 25th of September 1900 to £1,000 each. As the brothers outwitted and even taunted the police and trackers hunting them, public pressure grew for the police to capture the men. The government instituted a process on the 2nd of October 1900 to proclaim the Governor brothers outlaws, so that when they failed to appear at a police station by the afternoon of the 16th of October 1900, they became outlaws who could legally be shot and killed on sight. They were proclaimed outlaws on the 23rd of October 1900, the last outlaws in Australia. On Friday the 12th of October, Constable Richard Harris and Tracker Landsborough were occupying the hut of a station named O'Doherty at the junction of the Hastings River and Leys Creek. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they heard movements outside and then saw a rifle flash as Constable Harris was hit in the hip by a bullet fired through an opening between the slabs. The bullet passed through his flesh and struck the wall of the hut. Harris and the tracker rushed outside, and they saw Jimmy and Joe Governor running towards the creek and dodging from tree to tree. Shots were exchanged, and Harris claimed to have hit Jimmy Governor. Harris bandaged his wound and walked to a nearby station and was taken to Port Macquarie for medical treatment. On the following day, the 13th of October, the Governor brothers were following the Forbes River in the Hastings River catchment north of Yarras. 3 men were stationed at a house on Edward Coombs' selection at Big Flat, placed there by the police in anticipation of a visit by the fugitives. 2 of the men were Herbert Byers, a kangaroo shooter from Ilan, and Robert Wood from Mudgee, both of whom had been involved in the hunt for the Governor brothers since late July. Mid-afternoon, the Governor brothers were sighted descending the ridge from the south and onto the flat where the house was located. The brothers approached the house slowly and cautiously, moving from cover to cover until they were within 70 metres. Wood and Byers held their fire, expecting them to come even closer. Suddenly, the 2 fugitives became alarmed and they made a run for it to the south. About 150 metres from the house, Jimmy Governor stopped and looked back, and Herb Byers took a shot through the crack in the wall. Jimmy fell and rolled over. The bullet had hit his mouth and passed through his cheek, knocking out 4 of his teeth. Wood also fired, the shot passing through the flesh of Jimmy's ass. Byers and Wood ran from the house, exchanging fire with Joe Governor. Jimmy raised himself, stumbled, and fell again. But eventually, he and his brother escaped into the surrounding forest. Byers and Wood followed for about a kilometre, but stopped chasing as light began to fade. With Jimmy wounded, he and Joe camped in the bush for the next 3 days. On the evening of Tuesday the 16th of October, the Governors struck up 19-year-old William Coombs, who was chopping wood on his family's selection on the Forbes River, 10 miles below where Jimmy had been wounded. They took him at gunpoint to William's uncle's selection about a mile away and asked him to go to the house and get some food for them, saying they would meet him on the opposite side of the river. Their house was being guarded by Constable Doyman and others, and the policeman prevented young Coombs from taking food to them. He also made the decision not to actually go out and search for the Governors in the dark. Coombs reported that Jimmy's condition was weak and he was not able to walk fast. His bottom lip was cut and hanging down, his tongue was swollen, and his face and mouth were bandaged. The following day, Wednesday the 17th of October, the Governors were sighted near George Branston's house on the Hastings River, 2 miles west of Yarras. Constable Young and a tracker were stationed in the house. Joe Governor was on the opposite bank and Jimmy was in the riverbed when Young and the tracker started firing at them. In the confusion and rapid responses to being fired upon, Jimmy and Joe Governor became separated. Joe ran away down the other side of the river. That was the last time Jimmy saw his brother. The police strategy of occupying houses and denying the outlaws opportunities for obtaining food had finally achieved some significant results. After he was separated from his brother, Jimmy Governor walked across the mountains further to the south. Joe Governor was travelling in the same direction, but he kept moving, whereas Jimmy remained in the district. Jimmy was in a weakened state, barely able to eat due to the wound in his mouth. After being shot, he had nothing to eat for 14 days but honey and water. He had a Winchester rifle, but only 2 bullets. And for about a week, he remained hidden, dispirited, and looking for food to scrounge. On Friday the 27th of October, John Wallace, the postmaster at Bourbon, was camped on his station at Bourbon Creek. He'd visited a neighbour, and when he returned mid-afternoon, Wallace found that his tucker bag and his billy were gone. Suspecting he had been robbed by one of the Governors, Wallace caught his horse and returned to Bourbon, after which he walked back through the scrub on the opposite bank of the creek and lay concealed, watching his campsite from a distance of about 60-70 metres. At dusk, in Wallace's words, "I saw a darkie come walking leisurely along to the fire." After ascertaining that the man intended to make the fire his camping place for the night, Wallace returned to the village and gathered a party of 7 other men. After planning their hiding places so none could be hit by a crossfire, the men took up their positions by about 3 a.m. Saturday morning, and they waited for daybreak. Just on daylight, Jimmy Governor stood up, 50 yards higher up the creek than expected, and only 20 yards from where one of the party, Tom Green, was stationed. Green called out, "Surrender!" and Governor grabbed his rifle and started running along the creek, with Green and John Wallace in pursuit, and firing at him with their breech-loading shotguns. After a chase of about 300 metres, with the others in the party closing in and firing, the outlaw finally fell when Tom Green shot him in the thigh. 2 members of the party were sent to Wingham to report the matter to the police. Governor lay stricken for over an hour, after which he began to move. Leaning on his elbow, he said, "I give you fellows credit for catching me. The fucking police could not run down a potty calf." Wallace returned to Bourbon to get a cart and others carried their prisoner to the road, and Jimmy Governor was taken by cart to Wingham. Governor's captors had fired at him with buckshot, so his wounds on this occasion were mainly superficial. In all, 40 pellets were extracted from his body. On Tuesday the 30th of October, Jimmy Governor was brought before the police magistrate at Wingham and charged with the murder of Helen Kurtz at Breelong on the 20th of July. Evidence at the hearing was mainly concerned with formal identification of the prisoner and accounts of admissions by Governor of having committed the crimes at Breelong. When asked if he wished to question the witnesses, Jimmy said no. The police superintendent then formally applied for the remand of the prisoner to Sydney, which was granted. On the 2nd of November, Jimmy was conveyed to Sydney aboard the steamer Electra. During the voyage, he played cards with the guards. The steamer arrived in Sydney on the evening of the following day, and Governor was taken in leg irons and handcuffs to Darlinghurst Jail. On Tuesday the 30th of October, John Wilkinson of Glenrock on Talbrook Creek, about 20 miles north of Singleton, was walking along his paddock after dark towards his brother George's place when he noticed a fire burning in a nearby gully. Later that night, Wilkinson and his brother, with just one rifle between them, went to investigate. When they got near, they could see a man asleep beside the fire. While his brother withdrew to the top of a hill to keep watch, John Wilkinson, with the rifle, worked his way forward, taking advantage of available cover as day began to break. Finding himself only about 20 metres away, he decided that hesitating might mean disaster, and so he ran towards the sleeper, calling out, "Surrender!" Joe Governor jumped up and Wilkinson fired, but missed. Joe grabbed for his rifle, but was unable to reach it as Wilkinson charged forward. Joe ran as fast as he could, and Wilkinson chased him through the hills and ravines, firing several times but missing on each occasion. Eventually, with Joe about 150 metres in the distance, Wilkinson stopped and he went down on one knee, took careful aim, and fired. With that shot, Joe Governor fell over the bank of the creek, dead. Jack Underwood was initially held in custody at Mudgee, with the expectation that the Governor brothers would soon be apprehended and a single trial could be held. But when that did not eventuate, legal proceedings were initiated against him. On the 18th of August, 1900, he was taken by train to Dubbo and then to Gilgandra, appearing before the Gilgandra Police Court on the 22nd of August, charged with murdering members of the Morby family and Helen Kurtz at Breelong. Witnesses were examined and evidence presented, and he was committed to stand trial for murder. He was tried for the murder of Percy Morby at Dubbo on the 2nd of October 1900 before Judge G. B. Simpson, and he pleaded not guilty. Ethel Governor and Jackie Porter had been held in custody until the day before the trial, but the Attorney General dropped the charges against them, as their evidence was required for Underwood's trial. Ethel gave evidence at the trial, but Jackie Porter and the boy Peter were withdrawn as witnesses, as it was decided that they didn't understand the concept of an oath. The cousins, Jack and Bert Morby, who survived the massacre, each gave evidence and both stated that they had not seen Underwood among the assailants. After an hour, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, but advised the court that they could not come to a decision as to who struck the fatal blows on Percy Morby. Judge Simpson then sentenced Jack Underwood to death. Jimmy Governor was arraigned before Judge Owen at the Sydney Central Criminal Court in Darlinghurst on the 22nd of November 1900, charged with the murder of Helen Kurtz at Breelong in July. Governor was defended by Francis Boyce, who immediately moved for the acquittal of the prisoner based on the fact that he was a declared outlaw and, therefore, he was not able to plead and defend himself against the indictment. Basically, his defense was that Jimmy was already guilty in the eyes of the law and he couldn't get a fair trial. The judge disagreed, holding that the objective declaration of outlawry was to bring about the person's capture for the purpose of putting him on trial. The jury returned a verdict in accordance with the judge's direction and was discharged. Another jury was then impaneled to try the case based on the evidence. Testimony for the prosecution on the first day of the trial was given by John Morby, followed by Morby's nephew George and son Albert, who had been in the house during the murders. Ethel Governor also gave evidence, together with a number of other witnesses. The case for the defence on the following day consisted of a written statement that Boyce requested be read on behalf of Jimmy as he couldn't read. The prosecutor objected to this, and the judge ruled that the statement had to be spoken out loud by Jimmy. Governor then read his statement to the court. After both counsel's closing addresses and a summing up by Judge Owen, the jury retired and returned after just 12 minutes to return a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. The prisoner was then asked if he had anything to say as to why the court should not pass a sentence of death upon him. Governor grasped the iron railings of the dock as he stood, and he shook his head. After drinking water handed to him by an attendant constable, he said in a weak voice, "No, nothing." Judge Owen then sentenced the prisoner to be hanged. There were rumours Governor's execution was to be put off until the authorities, recovering from festivities to celebrate Federation, had sobered up sufficiently to enjoy the hanging. Even with a delay, it was still a modest turnout on the 18th of January 1901. There were only a few officials, 4 members of the press, and 5 private citizens in attendance, including John Morby's brother. Governor managed to smoke a cigarette as he emerged as the most important member of the execution parade. The hangings of First Nations men were rarely reported, but Governor was so famous, it was reported that he fell 7 feet and 6 inches. Death was instant. A little more than a month after Jimmy Governor's execution, wax figures of Joe and Jimmy Governor and their victims were exhibited at the waxworks at Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. After she was released from jail prior to Jack Underwood's trial in October 1900, Ethel Governor and her child were admitted to a charitable institution in Sydney. She visited her husband in prison on a number of occasions prior to his execution. Ethel was pregnant and gave birth to a child, Thelma, in April 1901 at Wollongong. Jimmy was the father. He never got to meet his daughter. In November that year, Ethel married another part First Nations man, Frank Brown, prompting racist comments in the press. One article declared, "The second marriage is just as repulsive as the first, for the bridegroom is a half-caste, and in spite of all her faults, the woman is white." The article concluded that the inevitable consequence of the marriage will be the completion of the damnation of her soul and addition to the piebald of a white Australia. Jesus, they went a bit over the top, didn't they? Ethel and Frank Brown had 11 children together, and Ethel died in October 1945. The life and crimes of Jimmy Governor was the basis for Thomas Keneally's 1972 novel The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, which was turned into a major motion picture in 1978 with David Gulpilil. Governor was also the subject of Australian poet Les Murray's poem, The Ballad of Jimmy Governor. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you watching the whole video. Join me next time as we troll through another episode in the true crime history of Australia. If you've enjoyed this video, once again, please go ahead and shoot the like button with your trusty boomstick and go all stabby on that subscribe button. Make sure that you also punch the notification bell in the face so you can get notified every time we release a new video. In all seriousness, it really does help us out. Remember, all of our episodes are released at the same time on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from. If you'd like to support the channel, please head to buymeacoffee.com/jsomething and buy me a beer. I'm on Instagram at somethingaboutmurder, and I respond to every message I receive. So I hope to hear from you, and I hope you don't get murdered. Stay safe out there.